Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories who, both past and present, and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite all to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore critical issues for our democracy with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now super excited to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm pleased to extend a warm virtual welcome back to the library to Tom Nichols, who is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, a columnist for USA Today, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is also an instructor at the Harvard Extension School and an adjunct professor at the U.S. Air Force School of Strategic Force Studies. His most recent book, and an excellent book, I will note for those of you who are out book shopping, is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. I'm also delighted to welcome back to the library virtually our moderator for this evening, Heather Cox Richardson, Professor of History at Boston College. Her writings have explored the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, the American West, and the history of the Republican Party. She is the author most recently of How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to actually extend a little bit your biography of Tom to introduce the people that many of the audience probably knows from Twitter. And that is that Tom Nichols is a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. He is the, I'd say he is owned by his very popular cat, Carla. And he is the man who started the fight over Indian food and whether or not Indian food was worth eating last year. And for those of you who have followed Dr. Nichols on Twitter and on social media, he does talk about both Carla and Indian food in the book, The Indian Food Story. And Tom, welcome. It's always a pleasure to work with you.
Thanks, Heather, and thank you to the JFK Library for hosting us, and thank you to you, Heather, for undertaking this and being willing to do this tonight. I really appreciate it.
Just so people know, I read everything Tom writes, and that should be a vote for this book. But I want to start right off quite literally with something you wrote in the book. First of all, you said in quite early on that in America, authoritarianism could arrive like Carl Sandburg's fog on little cat feet. Shout out to Carl, I suspect. Quietly establishing itself while the rest of us are busy watching television, staring at our phones, and speaking to our friends and family through emojis. And then you actually said earlier on, in a liberal democracy, citizens are the masters of their fate. If we believe democracy has failed us, we should first ask ourselves whether we have failed the test of democracy. Can you explain to us what you are doing in this book and why you undertook this project?
Sure. I think anyone who studies American politics, as you do, or studies comparative politics and looks around the world. I actually began my career as a student of Russia. I think we would all agree democracy is in trouble, that the great wave of democratization that had us all so hopeful 30 years ago is clearly running into trouble. Democracy is under siege. And I don't just mean participation, I mean liberal democracy, the kind of democracy that's based in equal rights, the rule of law, tolerance, secular government, an even legal and political playing field, fair and regular voting, that this kind of system is under siege in the United States, in the UK, even the UK, the mother of all parliaments, Turkey, Poland, Brazil, Hungary. This is really the democracies of the world fighting a kind of rearguard action. And I had this nagging sense. I wrote a book before this called The Death of Expertise, about people kind of taking pride in being ignorant and uninformed. And every time I talked about that book, people said, well, what does this mean for democracy? And I'd say, I think it means nothing good. And it's a symptom of something else. And every time I started to try to peel back that onion a bit, all of the explanations were external. They all denied any role for human agency in them. They said, well, it's the economy, it's globalization, it's change, it's frustration, and I said, that leaves no role for the choices of individuals here, for the choices of human beings. And this was especially difficult, before we came out on stage here, you and I were talking, and I was blocked trying to write this book for a few months because there was a paradox I was trying to explain, because the problems of the economy and globalization and income inequality and all those things, those are all real things. The problem is the people that are leading the illiberal charge, the people that are now the enemies of constitutionalism and of liberal democracy, are not the people that are being hurt by that. It's primarily a middle-class phenomenon, which is, I think, we really saw that up close on January 6th. These weren't all unemployed factory workers. They were real estate brokers and accountants and dentists. And so I said, maybe we're missing something important. So I started to think about things that seemed to be more important over time. And I came to what I think was a counterintuitive explanation, that democracy is corroding. And that's why I came back to this issue of little cat feet, even though I'm surrounded by them sometimes, because we are successful, because we are affluent, because we are bored, because we are used to a high standard of living, because our sense of entitlement has gone through the roof. And I think, other people saw this coming in earlier times. In the book, I talk about Eric Hoffer, who warned us about the possibility of a kind of bored anti-democratic uprising in 1951. Francis Fukuyama, who in 1992 talked about how people may well turn against democracy just to have something to do. But I think what was really surprising about it was that it tracks so well with the growing affluence, long period of peace. People don't want to hear that, but we have been, even with our overseas deployments, which we have outsourced to volunteers, unjustly, I believe. We've been at peace for a long time, and we've lived with a very high standard of living that has improved dramatically, even within our lifetimes of mine and people sitting here. So that's why I wrote the book, because I thought we have to stop looking out, we have to turn inward and ask ourselves, why is this happening, and why don't we feel like we're in charge of it anymore?
So why don't you walk us through that? What exactly do you mean by laying at the feet of individuals, especially fairly consistently well-off individuals, the crisis in our democracy? And I'm, of course, going to push back on that.
Of course.
That's why they pay me big bucks, Tom.
Well, for one thing, it's one thing to say, I think when I've gotten that kind of pushback to say, but there are people really suffering, right? There are people going through economic hard times. They are objecting to policies. What really strikes me are the people objecting to the structure of liberal democracy itself. Instead of saying, look, I don't like Joe Biden or I don't like Donald Trump, they're saying this whole Constitution idea is a bad idea. Equal rights is nonsense. You have a whole class, for example, of conservative intellectuals who basically openly advocate for theocracy. And I don't mean fringe guys, in some storefront in Kentucky. I mean like a guy at Harvard Law School who says a religious sovereign should take our rights from us and we will literally thank him for it. I quote that in the book. And I said, this is a group of people who are looking for meaning and fulfillment in a life that has become for them lacking of any kind of meaning or challenge. And I think also that, and the word I haven't used yet, the underlying condition that fuels all of this, and I talked about it in The Death of Expertise, and I talk about it in this book, is a 40-year pandemic, at least 40-year pandemic of narcissism. That is empirical, it's demonstrable. Social psychologists have found it all around in the developed world, that we've turned inward, we've become a more narcissistic society. And I don't just mean selfish. I don't just mean I want a bigger house or I want a bigger car. I mean, literally that, we are now a society that increasingly has large numbers of people who say the only real person in the world is me, and everyone else is a kind of cardboard cutout figure in the big play of my life, in the big, reality TV show that I call my life. And I think that has fueled a lot of all of these other malign developments.
So do you think it's fair to say then that the crisis of democracy is rooted in a psychological crisis amongst Americans who have lived a life of too much affluence really in the last 40 years? Not just
Americans, Brits, I don't want to use this as a connotation of religion, but it's almost a spiritual crisis. There's an emptiness. And you see this in the people that are the most violently committed to the destruction of democratic systems. Eric Hoffer 70 years ago referred to it. He said that when this kind of ennui and aimlessness overtakes people, they search for holy crusades because it gives meaning to their lives and it makes it exciting to get up every morning. I didn't notice, I talk a lot about pop culture in the book, but one pop culture reference I didn't note in the book that I'll bring up here. Think of the fact that for the last 20 years, the biggest grossing movies in America are superhero movies. Yeah. I'm sorry, but that tells you something about a public, and I love superhero movies. I guess I'll spoil how Avengers, I was sad when Tony Stark died. That bummed me out.
Oh man, now I can't watch it.
I know, right? Now you waited 15 movies to find this out. Sorry. But I think, there's something weird about a culture that you really can't make movies for adults, that all movies are popcorn movies about superheroes. And I think we live this way. And if you talk now, I think one of the most fascinating things coming out are looking at the transcripts of the interviews with the January 6th rioters. They all have this immensely overblown, grandiose sense of heroism. You see it in the QAnon phenomenon. You see it in the conspiracy theories. Everyone wants to be the hero of their own reality show. They all want to be the hero of their own action movie. And the poorest people in America, who, by the way, are not white, are not the ones that are, leading the charge, terrifying school boards and rushing the Capitol. Those are people that are asking the system to produce better outcomes for them. That's normal in a democracy to say, I'm electing you. You need to come up with better policies. Those are not the people that are trying to destroy democracy. The people that are trying to destroy democracy are the ones who are saying, things aren't, I have a lot of nostalgia about the way things were when I was a kid in 1970. And since I'm not living the life I think I should be living, this whole Constitution idea was just a bad idea. And I'm going to elect a strong man who's going to punish my enemies and take care of me and transfer power to me and hurt other people. And that's a real theme now in democratic politics is I'm electing you not because you're going to do good things, but so you can hurt someone else.
Okay, I want you to talk more about that. I want to clarify that you mean small d democratic politics and not
Right.
the Democratic Party. But
Right.
so walk us through that, the idea of politics as tribalism, or not politics yet, because you're really not talking about politics. You have some great examples of an Italian community and
Mm.
what that might say about American. I think maybe politics is the wrong word in this. American
Civic culture.
Civic culture.
Yeah, our civic culture. You know, there was a time when if you did comparative politics or cross-national studies, everybody had to read the book that I referred to in this book. It was called The Moral Basis of a Backward Society. It was a classic by as you and I both know, a giant of the field, a guy named Edward Banfield, who died some years ago. And we all had to read this book about by Banfield back in the day, because Banfield made the point that things don't work because institutions are good. Things work because people are good and they make them work. That even bad institutions or flawed institutions work pretty well if people cooperate with each other. And that's what Banfield was really trying to explain. He was a New Deal guy who was trying to explain international development. So I thought it was important to resurrect Banfield and to get Americans away from constantly thinking about themselves. Like, look, here's an Italian village in 1956, and it doesn't work. And I had all these quotes from people who say things like, no one thinks of the common good. They just envy anyone with education or money. And I kept saying, does this sound familiar? Does this town seem like the town you live in? Because that's where we're heading back to. And what used to really characterize American life is that we weren't like that. Part of the reason American students had to read this book was to understand, oh, it's interesting. Italy in the 1950s, America in the 1950s, two very different cultures. Things here, we don't write down a lot of stuff here in America. Things work because we just kind of agree to make them work. You know, we don't have a very long, Heather, you're the American politics expert. You know that our Constitution, by comparison with other constitutions, it's not that long. Doesn't say a whole lot, right? It sort of says, here's some basic rights. Now play nice with each other.
Yeah, good luck.
Good luck, you know, because we trust you, you know. I was trying to bring in this international example to say, this is what it looks like when it doesn't work. And Italy is not the Soviet Union. It's not Venezuela. This is a democracy in the 1950s of people that you would recognize. And this is what happens when they won't get along with each other and cooperate. One of the most heartbreaking parts of that book is that there's an orphanage in this village and by the way, this guy Banfield went and lived there for a year. He just like hung out with these folks. This orphanage for little girls that's run by nuns is literally falling apart around their ears, and they never have enough to eat. And yet this town of unemployed stonemasons and farmers don't donate any labor. They don't fix it up. They don't donate any food, nothing. Because you know what they say? It's not my children. That's their problem. And I said, this is where America is heading, where we simply say, my family, my children, fine. Other people, they're on their own. Or as one of the most famous authoritarian sayings there is, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law.
So you made an interesting point I think it was in a conversation, not in this book, in which you talked about the argument that the problems with American democracy now are economically based. And your point was, hey, this kind of boredom, if you will, this kind of nostalgia for the past is actually predates the issues that arose after 1981. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, partly because I think of myself as a connoisseur of cheesy classic rock. You know, I brought in a lot of pop culture references because people, and I have to tell you that part of the book, I don't think I could have written it until I'd gotten older. I'm 60 now, and I don't think I could have written it much younger than this, because part of what motivated me to write it were that younger people saying to me, but Professor, you have to understand, these are the worst times ever. And I would say, these are not even the worst times in my own lifetime. Yeah. And so I pointed out, you know, I love Bruce Springsteen. Before anybody gets mad at me, I'm just going to say, love the boss, like all good Americans do, right? But Bruce Springsteen was writing about the collapse and the men with death in their eyes, being turned out of dying factories in 1976. And then he writes about it again in 1984. And then he writes about it again in 2012. This is like it's almost like this madrigal that we learn, by rote around the campfire. And every 15 years, we sing this song about how everything fell apart and it's terrible and it's the worst times ever. At some point, we have to stop doing this to ourselves. I would argue that the 1970s were in every way worse than the time we live in now. And yet we weren't sitting around worrying that we were all going to overthrow, Jimmy Carter. We turned him out of office and we said, somebody come up with a better idea. But the idea that the Constitution itself was fatally flawed was not an issue. And I think we forget that.
I do want to point out that we are taping this on October 27th. And on this date in 1975, it was the date that Bruce Springsteen showed up on both the cover of Time and the cover of Newsweek. So
wow.
Yeah, that's really unusual for that to happen.
That's synchronicity.
Yeah, so there you go. That's probably the universe.
And why was Springsteen on the national covers? Because they said this troubadour is speaking to the working class of their frustrations that finally no one has ever understood. And, it was 45 years ago.
Jungle Land, right?
Ago, and at some point you have to say, how many times can you sing the same song over and over again? Now, I think a lot of people on both the right and left would say, well, if we keep singing the same songs, it's evidence that the system is unjust and always has been. But I just don't think that's the case. I think it's something that it's a story that we tell ourselves, and we pass it along like legends, like urban legends and campfire stories. I point out in the book, for example, that there was a political scientist who studies the Ohio Valley, and he said, well, you have to understand, ever since the mill closed, people here have been on the wrong end of job loss. And I went and looked it up. The mill closed 44 years ago. Now, that would be like people in 1980 still talking about the Depression. Think about it. Think about how long we think of 44 years, as, well, that's 1977. Saturday Night Live was on the air. It still is. Bruce Springsteen was making records. He still does. But if you were talking about this in 1977 or 1978, you're literally talking about, FDR.
So you have been described in this book by E.J. Dionne, the Washington Post columnist, as writing a great Jeremiad. And this is, I think, probably puts you in the. You're looking confused. It's on the book, Tom.
No, I'm nodding and saying, I know it sounds so biblical and like well, I'm standing outside the gates of Jerusalem mourning, but yeah.
Well, the reason that I mention it is because in many ways, this is a cultural description of the moment in which we sit, and that echoes Jeremiads all the way back to, 1671 when Edward Danforth wrote The Errand into the Wilderness, saying, things used to be good and look at where we are now. And, we've had those again and again and again where everybody says, oh, things were better in the past. And so I want to go back to the cultural explanation and its psychological component that you've laid out here. But now I'm going to push back on you in a couple of ways, because you've mentioned Hoffer a number of times and how he identified a population that was bored as being, a very dangerous population. Oh, and by the way, to go back to the cultural thing, when the Pilgrims said that they'd fallen away and their kids were getting fat and lazy, they up and moved to North America, where they had to, fight the death rates that they knew about in Virginia.
And then they had a falling out and they moved to Providence.
and we're really going to make these kids, good again. We're going to kill them, But Hoffer did talk about the boredom of a population and how dangerous that could be. But the reason they were dangerous was because that made them ripe for the picking by a dictator. And what as a political historian, there's a couple of things that I missed here that I feel like I would love to hear you talk about, because there is certainly an argument to be made that the attempt to destroy our government is really a product of the era after Nixon, after, Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and you do mention Pat Buchanan in the book, deliberately tried to divide the American population and put the white guys on one side, everybody else on the other, and to tell the white guys that the government was being used by everybody else, and the only way they could regain their own liberty was to destroy that government. It's really, and we're in a moment right now where we literally have a major group of people who don't believe in democracy, and they're 2 generations into this language. Is it the politicians that interacted with this group of bored people to create this attack on our democracy?
In the book, I call them political entrepreneurs because they're not always politicians. And I should have talked about that more but at some point you start just giving a litany of bad guys, Father Coughlin, Huey Long.
Could you do a quick idea of who they are?
Oh, sorry. Father Coughlin, the anti-Semitic, Father Coughlin was like the early version of Facebook, where he would go on the radio. He's a Catholic priest. He'd go on the radio and he would just deliver these kind of blistering anti-Semitic screeds. And he had a big following.
This is in the 1930s, and he actually does become a proto-fascist.
Yeah. Huey Long in Louisiana. Well, I'm a ruffian and a rapscallion, but I'm going to take over the government. I'm going to, basically I'm going to evade the Constitution and rule like the populist that I am. Buchanan. And actually, I will disagree that it starts with Nixon. I think the first person who really drills this poison into the modern American soul is McCarthy.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Talk a little bit about McCarthy and where he comes from.
Yeah, McCarthy, Wisconsinite, and I think he is the godfather of a lot of what happens now. And I'm going to push back because I can already hear people, even through the internet, I can hear them murmuring Reagan, and I'm going to push back on that comparison. McCarthy was one of the people who realized early on that by generating massive amounts of paranoia and hate, you can become very popular, very popular, very powerful, very fast. And in this, he's aided by Roy Cohn, who ends up being the lawyer to another famous president of the United States, Donald Trump. And McCarthy basically says, your government has become they're not the real government. They've become infested by enemies, including maybe even Dwight Eisenhower. Now, the great thing about McCarthy is that he was a drunk, and he got a lot, he wasn't that adept at it, and he went too far. People started drawing the line at, wait a minute, you're accusing, Ike and people that were in the, it's only World War II has only been over for 10 years. You still had a bunch of people that served in the military and had fought overseas who said, whoa, I knew these guys. This is not, the government is not in the hands of communists, and you need to step off here. And decent people, but that's the other thing, of course, is that we still had a cadre of decent people who would step forward and say, at long last, have you no decency, Senator? And the Senate finally censures him. Nixon, I think.
But let's just throw in there that there is a defense of McCarthy mounted in 1954, which is the year that we have the Army McCarthy hearings, where we get that very famous line, at long last have you no decency, and it breaks McCarthy. But William F. Buckley Jr. writes a book saying, that was pretty good. Let's do that again. That's, he might have broken some eggs, but you got to do that to make an omelet. And this is how we're going to get rid of this New Deal government that is turning us all into proto-communists.
And I think you can't divorce that from the early days of the Cold War, because these guys could, the young Buckley, the guy who repudiates himself in the 1950s and 60s, breaks with the Birchers, breaks with his own position on civil rights, eventually into the 60s. They're all looking at it and saying, if we lose, we basically become an outpost of Stalinism. Now, that may have been nonsense, but it was nonsense that you could sell to yourself in a time when people genuinely were paranoid. You see this now in declassified documents within the United States government, that there were people saying, we really are losing the Cold War. This is going to end in the 1950s with a communist Europe and a fortress America, and, the whole thing's going to go bad. That doesn't excuse that kind of rationalization, but it's also important to remember that William F. Buckley in the 1950s isn't that powerful. I think the guy who really, you brought up Nixon, and I think Nixon is the guy who makes the case that I will be your champion against the effete Eastern Ivy Leaguer. The people that I know are looking down on you because they looked down on me. You know,
it's Buchanan who sets that whole argument up.
But Nixon felt it. Let's face it, Heather. I mean, Nixon, you know, to his dying day, felt like he had just never, he was, you know, this brilliant man who had never been accepted into the club. And, you know, he was the awkward guy who walked on beaches in his black tie Oxfords, you know, and he loved Jack Kennedy and hated him at the same time. I mean, you know, this, but, and again, what is different now? Richard Nixon, one of my favorite stories about Nixon is that when he was told that Kennedy might die during surgery for his back, actually bursts into tears. Like Nixon was like this evil guy who hated the Kennedys and was plotting against them at every turn, and yet could be brought to tears at the thought that Jack was going to die. We don't, I mean, that's almost quaint now. And I think in the 1960s, Nixon's effective this way because, and this actually ties to what we're talking about now with the book, people are still remembering the past, and they're talking about the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, when what they really mean was the magical 15 years between 1945 and 1960, where American manufacturing controlled the world. And everybody, there was a job, and, you know, Southern California was, you know, everybody buying a tract house, and Levittown. Of course, we didn't want to talk about racial covenants because it's all about white guys. And Nixon comes forward and he says, I totally get it. I get you. But that doesn't quell it. And, you know, Nixon, I think, you know, ironically governs as what we would today think of as a rhino, a very liberal Republican.
For sure.
And yet, even I mentioned in the book, the hard hat riots. Here we are in 1970. They've elected, you know, the American people have elected Nixon. He's on his way to a landslide in 72. And yet people are still saying, no one listens to us. No one's listening to the white working class and the steel workers and the union guys. And again, I find myself just, you could take those passages and apply them to anybody in 2021 and you wouldn't know that anything had changed.
Well, so I'd asked about the degree to which politicians were pushing this narrative that the government needs to be tied down. But now you just brought something else up. Time magazine in 1970 said that the middle America, that they made their people of the year the middle Americans, the forgotten Americans that feel like they're being left out. And they reached back to Barry Goldwater. So I want to take on the role of politics in this and the role of media in this. And just to give you a heads up and our listeners a heads up, I'm actually being fed questions, and we're not supposed from the audience, and we're not actually supposed to touch those for another half hour, but some fit so nicely in here. I'm going to go ahead and start bringing them in, but I can't identify you by name because I'm not getting the names. So they'll be there. You should listen for them. So what about the media? So you're sort of saying, yeah, the politics are around this issue, but you're still attributing them to sort of, you know, boredom among a certain population. And now we got the media in there telling that bored population that they should be out in the streets. What about politics in the media?
Yeah. Well, first, I just think it's great. 1970, the forgotten people. You know, how many times, I mean, if all you do is write about them for 40 years, they're not forgotten. I'm sorry, but this is just, you know, can I say, I mean, I guess I shouldn't use the word bullshit at the Kennedy School, but it's just BS. I mean, at some point, you know, he's saying, oh, I'm a forgotten man, just like my father, just like my grandfather, just like everybody who's ever come through this town to ask us over and over again why we feel forgotten. You know, it's almost, if the stakes weren't so deadly high and serious, it's almost ludicrous and laughable.
So do we urge the media then to ignore these people?
I think part of the problem is, you know, that the media, after about 1980, when you start developing the 24-hour news site, and the real villain here, by the way, is not CNN, it's ABC's Nightline, which develops the first kind of every night talking heads, you know, in half an hour, because it develops in response to the Iran hostage crisis. But once we get to that point, first of all, every journalist knows if it bleeds, it leads, right? Bad news always leads. Bad news is always what people want to hear. And if you've got to keep people glued to the television for 24 hours, you can't be happy talk. You can't do the Today Show and the middle of the day, a housewives cooking show from the 1960s. You can't do that all day. You've got to keep people riveted, and it's got to be with bad news, and it's got to convince them that things are terrible and that all the bad things in the world are happening right now and they're happening to them. The immediacy of cable is something we don't talk enough about, that every bad story in the world comes right to your living room and happens to you in real time.
Okay, so I want to,
and I'm sorry, let me just add, and that convinces you that's how people get into their head. My government is completely feckless. I can't be protected. Everything's falling apart. Democracy is a complete sham if all it's going to produce is landslides and shootings and, misery and truck overturns and chemical spillage and all that people just say, well, obviously everything's broken.
So it's not just that they're bored, it's that they're being fed a certain kind of narrative. And somebody has asked here, isn't everything that Tom is describing an indictment of republicanism itself? And I'm going to be the narrator here and say current day republicanism, because of course it's changed a lot over time, the Republican Party. Why is it that these pathologies seem to be almost monopolized by one party?
I think that's true today, but I'm gonna push back on this. And I was waiting for someone to bring this up because one of the famous quotes that always gets thrown out here is Reagan talking about government being the problem, right? Government is the problem. I think that people on the left, it's easy to forget what the 1970s looked like and how we got to 1980. So that you had Republicans saying, they're not out to dismantle the whole government. They're just out to make it smaller and more efficient, like businessmen, right? They're going to come in, government's going to be smaller. We're going to have a large defense sector, and then everything else gets block granted back to the states and all of that stuff. I think, it's normal for center left and center right parties to argue about how big government should be. And that was a normal argument we were having throughout the 70s and the 80s. And I think there were a lot of voters, and I was one of them, who felt like the policies of the 1970s were mostly failures. Well, just hear me out. And so to say, I didn't, but that didn't mean that Republicans were walking around saying, therefore, the Constitution should be shredded.
Yeah, but how do we get from that to here?
From that to here, I think actually that story begins in the 90s. I think that story begins with a group of boomers, and I'm going to make this a more generational accusation, from Bill Clinton to Newt Gingrich, who looked at politics as, we must win. Our team must win. And even though Gingrich and Clinton actually end up balancing the budget and kind of working together on stuff, they both think it becomes a kind of like, we have a right to rule because we are better than the people we're fighting against. And bipartisanship, which existed throughout the 1980s, existed even back into the 70s, even into the turbulent 60s. Bipartisanship starts to fall apart as in the 90s, I think people start deciding that if government doesn't give me what I want, government itself, the concept of a liberal democracy, is just flawed. And I'm going to make some people mad here, but when it's easy for people on the right to come to that conclusion when Bill Clinton is celebrating beating an impeachment on the South Lawn. There were people who walked away from that, said, okay, I get it. That all the laws are a game. This is how we're going to play it. I think Newt Gingrich is the source of a lot of original sins. He was one of the people that really kind of alienated me from conservative politics. But I still would argue that the reason we had this unserious politics, that we had a president as in many ways as unserious as Bill Clinton, a vicious huckster as unserious as Newt Gingrich, is because we had won the Cold War. We were in a period of economic prosperity. Living standards were increasing dramatically. There was something about the period before 1990 that kind of made us have to take politics seriously. And I'll give you one example about the Republicans. Republicans were not big fans of civil rights in the 1950s. but they did take seriously the notion that you can't really fight the Cold War and point out how awful communism is if you're really not living up to the civil rights promise in the United States. And that actually converted a lot of Cold Warriors in the Republican Party, as well as in the Democratic Party, some of the old school, old South Democrats saying, we can't go up against the Kremlin while enslaving and brutalizing people in our own country. We really have to be better than this. It kind of made us have to hold to our own standards. I think in the 90s and ever since, we just sort of said, like people say on Twitter now, lol, nothing matters, lol, whatever, laugh out loud, whatever. And there was a lack of seriousness that I think is just poisoning us because we've had the luxury of being unserious.
See, I think it was deadly serious with the fall of communism that anti-communism gets turned internally. I mean, quite literally, there are documents saying this is great. Now we can wipe out, the liberalism at home. And it's interesting to think about you putting Clinton and Gingrich together when it's Gingrich who shuts down the government repeatedly and Clinton celebrating his lack of conviction in his impeachment trial, but his popularity was over 70% by the time the Senate actually sits down to vote, because everybody thinks that this is exactly as you say, an attack on government rather than an attempt really to make somebody accountable for bad behavior.
But Heather, I'm going to say that your point about popularity makes my point rather than yours. Because what we ended up doing after the 1980s, and actually I would say going back to the 60s, but especially with Reagan, this is where I will push Reagan into the spotlight and say, we decided that if a president was popular, a president is right. That popularity equals rightness, and that popularity was all that mattered. I don't think it was all that great that Reagan could short circuit a lot of what happened by just going on television and saying, well, golly, and people say, oh, you got to love the guy. Well, wait a minute. I voted for the guy. And even I was saying Iran-Contra is an impeachable offense. That is a constitutional crisis. And instead people said, well, what are you going to do? He's popular. Well, and Congress said that, well, he's popular. Popularity has paved the way. I would argue it starts with Jack Kennedy, but it paves the way for a culture of celebrity. And that's why, I talk about this in the book. I mean, where we get to 2020 and Joe Biden, whatever you think of Joe Biden, and I voted for him too, Joe Biden's got to stand there on stage and look down the podium at Marianne Williamson and have an argument with Marianne Williamson in public. Like, this is a serious country. This is how we're taking liberal democracy seriously. Meanwhile, Donald Trump walks in, insults everybody. Everybody says, well, I actually argued for excluding Trump from the Republican Party and from the debates. And I said, the RNC should treat him like David Duke. He's not a Republican. I mean, you know what the answer I got from Republicans was? He's popular.
So you are attributing the problems we're in to the affluence and boredom of this group of people. And now we're throwing politics in the mix, and we're throwing the media into the mix. And somebody here says, do you think Donald Trump was smart enough to realize these patterns you're talking about, or did he just play to the simplistic hatred and prejudices of people?
I think Trump is a moron, but he is a genius in one sense, in that he has an innate sense for marketing. And I think he said, if you read the beginning of Bob Woodward's book, there's this great moment. Bannon walks in and says,
Peril, you mean?
The first one, Fear.
Yeah.
Where Trump's deciding to run. And Bannon walks in and says, but you're pro-choice. And Trump says, okay, fine, I'm pro-life.
Yeah.
But he says, but you've been donating, you're a Democrat. You've been donating to Democratic candidates for years. And he says, okay, fine, I'll donate to Republicans. I'm a Republican. But Trump sensed that people don't care about policy or ideological consistency. They care about feeling like there's some tribal warrior who's going to piss off everybody they don't like. Talk a little bit
more about that, because you talk about that with regard to the Italian community, but I think it's an important point in this book.
Yeah, this sense that politics, again, I think when you're poor, why was FDR so popular? FDR said, here are things I'm going to do that are going to make your life better. When you're affluent, you say, you know what I really want? I want to see somebody else suffer because they have a little bit more than I do. You know, it's interesting that we don't really focus our rage in this country on super rich people. Nobody really hates Jeff Bezos that much. I mean, they don't even hate Bill Gates that much, except they think he's sticking microchips in their vaccines. The people they reserve their hatred for are the people they think are just doing a little bit better than they are down the street. And again, Hoffer warned us about it. We know from social psychology experiments that people tend to resent the people closest to them in status. And so instead of saying, look, you know, what can you do for me? They're saying, you know what, just hurt other people. And I have quotes in the book from people whose politics are completely incoherent. My favorite is the woman who says, well, I'm the Iowa caucus voter who says, I'm for Pete Buttigieg. But if I can't get Buttigieg, I guess I'll vote for Trump.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you can't, to go back to the question from the audience, Trump realized that people don't really care about stuff. They care about things being interesting. There's a voter that the New York Times interviewed, a California voter who said, look, I don't like Trump. I don't like his policies. He said, but I admit, I just want to see people fight. It'd just be more interesting. You know, he said, I generally agree with Hillary Clinton, but I have to admit, there's a dark side of me. Just want to see what's going to happen. Well, you know, when you live in a society with enough guardrails and bumpers on it that you can afford to be unserious and to say, hey, let's just see what happens. We don't worry anymore about the fact that the president holds the codes to 1,500 strategic nuclear weapons on standby. We don't worry about the fact that the president is the chief magistrate that protects, you know, swears to defend the Constitution and enforce its law. We just say, what would be a good show for 4 years? That is a fundamentally unserious country.
Another question here, is this issue heightened by the shrinking middle class, do you think? Are we increasingly like South America where there are wealthy and poor and little in between?
Well, part of the problem is that the middle class and you know, I didn't want to make the book a big fight about econometrics, but you know, one reason the middle class is shrinking is because a lot of the middle class is becoming upper class. And yeah, there is nothing in the middle where we're getting a wealthier pyramid of inequality and no sense that you have to help the people behind you. If you can kind of make it out of that, then you're fine. And, you know, you move to a better neighborhood. In the book, I talk about one of the bleak futures where we have glittering skyscrapers and then favelas in every direction. But again, we chose these things. We became a consumerist society that said, look, we want 3 cheap televisions in our house. And we don't want any guff about where they're manufactured or who's going to make them. We want, you know, to upgrade our phones every 3 years. We want to keep rolling over our cars. I talk about this in the book with 7-year car loans, you know, that have now been an instrument for about 30 years, where young people buy new cars, turn them in, upgrade, roll over the set. I mean, we made these choices, and now we're looking around saying, how did we end up in this horrific situation? And I specifically talked about the 2008 housing crisis, because in the end, you know, it was Wall Street going to the casino with a lot of securitized bad debt. But as even The Big Short pointed out, for those of you who've read the book or seen the movie, part of the reason this was able to happen was because in the 1970s, there weren't any bad mortgages. You weren't allowed to take them out. And Americans now are saying, why didn't some this drives me crazy about Americans in particular, saying, why didn't some paternalistic government stop me from doing this? And by the way, the government should mind its own business and get out of my life.
But so let me go the next step here. I'm trying to find a question that somebody threw at me and I here in the chat, and I can't actually find it, but I know what was the gist of it. And that is, to what degree is our educational system responsible for this sort of throwing up our hands and saying, we trust democracy is going to work and we don't really know what it's all about?
You know, it's a terrible thing for a teacher and a kid from a working class background who achieved social mobility through education to say this, but I don't think education is the answer. The people that are the most illiberal people in America, that is to say, people my age, are products of what we now think of as a golden age of public education, of well-funded public schools, of cheap colleges and universities. And yet those people 55 and over are actually some of the most dangerously illiberal people in America. My hope is that the kids are all right, that the generation coming up, the younger kids today, even behind the millennials, are actually better people and kind of more used to living in a diverse world. They're more acclimated to social media. They don't think it's it's fascinating and true all the time. And I also would argue that universalizing the idea of college education hollowed out a lot of American towns faster than China did. Because instead of people becoming plumbers and carpenters and electricians, they went off and blew 3 or 4 years at a local college, ran up some debt, kind of deferred adulthood for a while, and then came out without any really meaningful skills. Peter Turchin, UConn, I mentioned him in the book, he calls this the overproduction of elites, where everybody goes to college and they have a college degree, and then they say, well, all that work that needs to be done, all the house wiring that needs to be done, that's beneath me. I went back to my old high school. I'm originally from Chicopee, Mass. I'm a son of the Commonwealth for our JFK audience. And my high school was a combination academic and vocational high school. And I went over to the vocational wing, and one of the teachers said, I can't send electricians to the union fast enough. Like every kid I get, I have a job for, but they won't do it. They won't come down here and become electricians because it's, everybody's going to go to college. And I think we've made mistakes on both ends of this, which is that civics education has basically collapsed. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure that civics education makes you more virtuous. The problem is that we are not a virtuous, liberal, democratic, small L, small d society anymore. And I don't think you can instill that with civics classes.
And you attribute that lack of public virtue or civic virtue to essentially affluence and boredom. Is that correct?
Mostly. Yep. Absolutely.
So just to follow up here on the education, somebody has asked, do you think that the people no longer value education? This person teaches in a public high school and says that as a teacher, this person can barely get the kids to listen, never mind to read.
Well, and this is what I mean about virtue. I mean, the notion that, public schools, this started happening back in the 90s. Again, this goes back to the 90s really worry me. That students, can walk into school and sort of tell off teachers to their faces and threaten them. I mean, one of my old high school teachers, I said, why did you retire? Because he retired, in his 50s. He said, he had a great line. He said, Tom, you were a pain in the ass in high school. Because I was not a good student, by the way. I was one of those kids that was going to go, I was either going to go to college or I was going to go to jail. And it was still a toss-up about halfway through school. He said, you were a pain in the ass. He said, but you never walked in here and told me that you're going to blow my brains out after school if I gave him any guff. And I think that there was a kind of breakdown, again, of kind of an affluence in society where parents just said, sure, go do your own thing. You're not children, you're little people like me. One of my high school teachers said he noticed that when students were coming in with notes that said, excuse my daughter, today we're going shopping together. Now, I don't know about you, I would have lived for a note like that from my parents. I had to be dying and spitting up blood to get out of school. But he said, I just started seeing this, an English teacher, very left-wing English teacher that I had growing up. And he said, and yet, I was just letting kids out of school regularly to go shopping with their parents. Well, that's the kind of thing that happens even in a working class town where people say, what matters is living well today and enjoying my life day by day rather than deferring gratification.
All right, so I've got some more questions to pull in here.
That sounded really curmudgeonly, I know, sorry, but.
No, I'm laughing here because at one point I was searching for a dress and my sister said, you wanna help me? And I said, no, I'm good. My daughter's helping. And she's like, you took your daughter out of school to shop for a dress? And I was like, it's her February vacation. I would never take a kid.
Okay. Like I was going to say, Heather, I don't know.
that was like you, we're almost exactly the same age. You know, you basically had to be at your death's door to miss a day of school. All right, so there's somebody says, you know, there's a whole narrative that you're not talking about, and that's the issue of race. The issue of race.
It's in the book.
So let's go ahead. Go where it says, where does Tom place racism in this?
I think a huge amount of what's happening in America is basically white racial anxiety. Again, combined with the kind of looseness and affluence that lets people act on it. You know, one of the things that made life different, I had a letter from somebody who grew up in my hometown in the 50s. He said, I don't know, Tom, those were pretty good times. I said, yeah, unless you were Black. And he said, well, they had union jobs. And I said, but not full rights as human beings. And I think, you know, when I think about Heather, I told you this story and I said I would tell it when we were on the air. One of my friends had a very kind of shady high school record, but he graduated, found a job, bought a house, had put kids through college, bought a boat. And in 2016, he said to me, I'm voting for Trump because America's all screwed up and everything has to change. And when I lost my temper with him. I said, that's right. I said, I'm sorry, you telling me this because you were sitting on your boat? But what he really meant is, I finally said to him, I said, our local barber shop is a Spanish church and you hate that, don't you? He said, yes. That's really what it came down to. He said, our neighborhood's been destroyed. It's full of people speaking Spanish. I said, yeah. And it used to be full of people speaking Polish and people speaking, you know, Italian and whatever. And he just, nope, that was it. And I think that explains a lot of this. And in the book, I point out that one of the most hypocritical turns that the conservatives took in America, that the Republican Party took under Trump, was that they now talk to the white working class the way they would have deplored liberals talking to minorities. You know, that when liberals in the 70s would say to inner city communities, look, it's not your fault. Drugs aren't your fault. They're being pumped into your neighborhood. It's not your fault that you're unemployed. You know, it's not your fault that you have children out of wedlock. These are, you know, and conservatives said, wait a minute, this is a dysfunctional culture. Maybe we ought to hold people responsible. 40 years later, Donald Trump is going to poor towns saying it's not your fault that you're addicted to drugs. It's not your fault that you can't find a job. It's not your fault that you don't get married and have children. Basically, we have developed a whole infrastructure in the conservative movement that has transferred what the kind of grievance politics language to the white working class. And it's appalling. It's just appalling. And there's no doubt about it in my mind that this has an immense racial component to it. And this was part of my break with all of the people on the right that I said, wait a minute, you know, this is literally stuff that you would have said is ridiculous 30 years ago. And now this is, and they say, yeah, well, that's different. And what they really mean is it's different because, you know, white people are victims and Black people aren't.
So this is a wonderful time to insert another question that says, please describe the fixed human nature you frequently refer to as a foundational element of your conservatism.
Well, I think with 3 minutes to go in the evening, I will say that.
Well, I'm sorry, we have. I think we go to 7:30, don't we?
Yes, we do. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong clock.
We're not letting you off the hook now.
No. Except I will say that one of the things that makes me a small c conservative is that I believe in a fixed human nature. That I don't believe that you can change human nature with large social projects that can produce. Now, maybe this is years of studying the Soviet Union, where when I hear a malleable human nature, I think of the attempts to create a new Soviet man. And so, you know, do I think, for example, that, human beings want to have families? You know, the idea that you can get rid of the nuclear family, which was a tenet of Soviet Marxism, right? Back in the day during the Cold War. I think people want to mate and have children and live in a nuclear family. I think that's just a fixed part of human nature. I suppose I believe that all human beings have some sense of transcendence. I don't think that means all human beings are religious, but I think that very few people in the world really are just absolute materialists. Because if that were the case, then most of us wouldn't be able to appreciate poetry. most of us wouldn't be able to appreciate music. There's some sense of something beyond ourselves, beyond our five senses. I think that's a fixed part of human nature, and that you can't just turn people into scientific rationalists through brute force. So a lot of why I believe that is in response to what I saw when I first started my studies of totalitarian regimes saying we can recreate people and change their social allegiances to, you know, something that the state prefers simply by the brute force mechanisms of ideology and propaganda and so on. It can work in the short term and usually produces tragedy, but I don't think you can overcome that in human beings over the long term.
If we were talking about communications, Tom would tell you that I'm frequently poking him to talk more about conservative values in the public sphere, because the current day Republican Party has taken over the word conservative and completely perverted it. And that's
why I hesitate to use it.
Yeah, I don't use it. I won't use that word any longer, except as an ideological movement, because it just doesn't have any meaning any longer compared to where it started. So we're going to get in just a second to where we go from here. There's a lot of questions about that, and I certainly have some questions, but there is one elephant in the room that I identified to you before today when we were talking about this, and that is that as you are outlining in this book, this lack of civic virtue and this focus on if it bleeds, it leads, and, you know, the excitement and the boredom and the affluence and all those things, what about women? I mean, you said you can't basically have, you know, the Home and Garden channel or whatever it is at night. Why not? It gets tons of watchers. I mean, to what degree are we in the mess we're in because of the fact that really or at least since the 1970s, the world in America has been monopolized by a certain special interest group, which are wealthier white men?
Well, what I meant about the news is, cable news can't do 24 hours of that. It can't be 24 hours of pleasantness and, you know, domesticity and warmth, because that just doesn't sell. You're not going to keep eyeballs glued to that all day. Even
come on. Have you ever watched Jane Austen? Like, you could do that all the time.
Yeah, well, if you think you can make money on a Jane Austen channel, I will wait to see that happen. But I think on cable news, you know, even some of the most popular, you know, we were mentioning offline, we were talking about Rachel Maddow. I mean, Rachel Maddow is a very popular big female audience. And even she is like, okay, I have scary things to tell you. And I'm going to walk you through this scary thing. And then we're going to know about the scary thing. It's very, you know, people just don't do cable shows on any channel that begins with, you know what, things went pretty well today. I talk about this in the book, where political campaigns have to be built around this, because nobody really runs for office saying, you know what, the other guy's doing really well, but I think I can do better. You know, I tell a story in the book, and I'm going to detour into this for a minute, about an old man, because he's in the beginning of the book. It's my father. My father was a bigot, a misogynist. He was born in 1918. He was an ethnic. I mean, he was Archie Bunker come to life. And at the end of his life, we were watching Barack Obama in the 2012 campaign, and we were both from Massachusetts. And I like Mitt Romney. I'm sorry, you know, I feel like I'm in a confessional. My name's Tom. I liked Mitt Romney back in the day. Fine. And I said, but Dad, I don't think it's going to happen. And my father really surprised me, because he said, they're both good men. We'll be fine. We'll be fine no matter who wins. And I kind of like, you know, was like, wow, to hear my father say that at 94 years old, just before he died. That's what I'm hoping we can get back to. But to come back to your point about men, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of this anxiety is the anxiety of white people, but of white men who are losing their place in society, but who have for 40 years been feeling like they're losing their place in society. And this is why the forgotten man rhetoric bothers me so much, because there has been no political constituency more catered to than white working class men, and mostly by white upper class men. And I feel this very keenly, because I was born a white working class male, and I transitioned into being an educated upper middle class white professional. And so it bothers me when I hear these guys say, well, nobody ever cared about us. That's all we do. All we do is sit in diners and ask these guys what they want all day long. And in the end, I don't want to reduce it to something this simple, but there is a part of me that says, this is the final stage of the longest male midlife crisis I've ever seen, where when you talk to these guys, and when I talk to my friends who are my age, and I say, what do you want? And what they basically say is, I want it to be 1970 again, but with a really nice car, ESPN, internet porn, and air conditioning. And that I think is just, and their answer is, and if I can't have that, democracy is a sham. Democracy screwed me. Liberal democracy is for the birds. And I, keep trying to bring this back to, yeah, you keep, and I'm gonna throw something here at people on the left, because when people on the left talk about economic determinants, as I point out in the book, they often pick 1970. They say, but Tom, in 1970, it is true that a single man with a family of four, a single working man could buy a house and his kids could go to college. And I'm like, okay, first of all, that for people on the left to say this and ignore the fact that, yeah, he could do that because his wife couldn't work. Not wouldn't work, but could not work, could not get a car, could not have a credit card. If he had a boy and a girl, one of them was going to college. When I started college in 1979, only 14% of American women went to college.
And the percentage.
I'm sorry, these are supposed to be the good old days that we're thinking about on both the right and the left. When what we really mean is, I think of the 1960s and 70s as a child, and my dad had a job, and those were great days because my mom, made dinner every night, and I really liked that. Well, you can have that lifestyle. Kevin Williamson, who's a writer on the right, who has, like me, taken a lot of brickbats in various. People think he's a lefty, then they think he's a righty. Williamson's the guy who got fired because he has some pretty retrograde ideas about abortion and criminalizing abortion. But Williamson made a great point. He says, if you want to live like it's 1957, you can do that very cheaply. You just don't want to. You don't want to because you don't want all the baggage that goes along with living in 1957, including taking public transportation and living in 3 rooms and having 1 television. And I think we just have to wrench ourselves out of this and stop idealizing All in the Family, which was a comedy and a cautionary tale, not a how-to guide for how to live.
So somebody here asks, says, in the book you mentioned that, and this is a quote, that arguments about income differences are primarily arguments about justice. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, when I bring up the failure, the people who believe democracy has failed, again, I actually am giving a lot of credit to folks on the left for not arguing that democracy has failed, for arguing that policy has failed, which I agree with them about. Policy is different than the Constitution. But even there, they say, but how can you defend, modern democracy when there's huge amounts of income inequality? Income inequality is not the same thing as poverty. That's what I keep trying to say to people. It's like, that's an argument about justice, about whether assets are being equitably distributed among us by whatever we think of as equitable and fair. As somebody who cares a lot about the economy, I also think income inequality is bad because it suffocates economic activity, because it just concentrates too much money in the hands of too few people. But that's not the same thing as a low standard of living. And every time someone brings up income inequality, I try to shift the argument to, yes, but are these folks suffering from a low standard of living? And I think the answer is, that we're all, even the poorest among us are better off than we were. But again, and I can't just I'm going to keep hammering this point. The people that are the most hostile to liberal democracy are not the people at the very bottom of the income scale. It's the people in the middle who I have a quote in the book from Edward Luce, who says, it's not a matter of people being material discomforted. I've got the book here, but he basically says it's not a matter of material discomfort. It's a matter of dashed expectations. And Luce says every generation thought that the next generation could live 3 or 4 times better than they did. Think about that. Think about what it would mean starting in, say, 1960, to think that every generation could live 3 or 4 times better than you did. At that point, we're living on spaceships.
You've got a great quote about that in the book, about how we were promised flying cars or something, and all we got was, what was that?
It was David. Actually, it's David Frum's comment. Peter Thiel, who to me is everything wrong with American politics. The guy who's funding millions of dollars in J.D. Vance's campaign. I mean, talk about political entrepreneurs, hedge fund managers who are riling up people in Ohio to say your life sucks and I'll go punish the bad people, even though my boss is a hedge fund billionaire. And by the way, this is a trend in other countries as well, that these populist movements inevitably are run by people with billions of dollars. But anyway, Thiel said, I was promised, flying cars, and all I got was 140 characters on Twitter. And David Frum said, yes, I was promised flying cars, and all I got was the ability, all the world's libraries in my pocket, and the ability to talk to my grandchildren anywhere in the world for free.
Yeah. But this, you just said something that's going to bring two other questions into play here. And this is, although you're focusing on personal lack of civic virtue, which I do want to get into how we address that. People have asked a number of questions about that. People have asked you to talk about Citizens United and the extraordinary role of money in our politics, along with the Council for National Policy, CNP, which is that secretive group that most people had never really heard of until the Washington Post and the New York Times broke stories about them the other day. But they've been around for a long time, yes. 1981, I think. So can you talk about the role of money and the role of these very well-funded secret conservative groups?
Well, only a fool would deny the role of money in politics anywhere. Back in 1898, Mark Hanna, who was running McKinley's campaign and became a senator from Ohio himself, he said, it was a great line. He said, the two most important things in politics are money, and I can't remember the other one.
Yes.
Nonetheless, money does not buy elections. And Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump significantly. J.D. Vance jumped into this. Peter Thiel set up a PAC with $10 million for him. And Vance is going to come in third in a Republican primary. He's getting thumped because, he's running against somebody even crazier than he is. But the idea that somehow you just throw your hands up and say, well, there's a lot of money in politics. Well, the thing that negates money in politics is voting. And I'm sorry, this is where I get curmudgeonly and irascible again. I'm tired of hearing about the influence of money in a country where we pat ourselves on the back for getting to 50 or 60% turnout. I know the next thing I'm going to hear is gerrymandering and vote suppression and dark money. The fact of the matter is, when we turn out, if you could increase the turnout of young voters under 30 by 6 or 7 points, all of this, the Republican Party would vanish tomorrow. You'd never see it again in most states. With the most dangerous election in my lifetime, 2020, we patted ourselves on the back for getting to about 65% turnout and about 50% youth turnout. And that was everybody. That includes the Republicans who always vote. Gerrymandering, vote suppression. I actually think voter voting rights right now, I actually think the Democrats are underplaying it. I think it should be the one thing Biden should be obsessing about, because if I, as someone who never cared very much about those issues, if I'm ringing the alarm bell and saying that these, voter suppression measures in these 3-4 states have to be stopped, Democrats should certainly be taking them a lot more seriously. But as somebody who worked in local, state, and federal politics, I will tell you that all of these shenanigans only work in marginal elections. They never stand up against mass turnout. And yes, you can buy a lot of that. You can buy prominence. You can buy name recognition. You can funnel money into PACs. You can buy advertisements. But, ask Mike Bloomberg how that works out. Ask Michael Huffington how it worked out. There are a lot of people who have dumped tons of money into elections and gone nowhere with it because people turn out. Look at the Georgia election. If you turn out and you have Donald Trump suppressing the Republican vote for a change, which was kind of funny, you get 2 Senate seats out of it. It can be done. And I don't like the fatalism that comes with saying, well, there's a lot of money out there. if it were up to me, I mean, I guess I'm a First Amendment absolutist, and I don't like telling people that they can't buy a billboard with their own money. I think the answer to all of this is transparency. I think that you have to always say where your money's from. You have to always say who's donating to you. You can't play this game with 15 shell companies, where you can't find it. But in the end, if you're an American and you have money, you have the right to spend money on an election. If you're running, you can spend all the money you want. That doesn't mean you're going to make it. It's up to the rest of us to turn out and show up.
So this is a great place in the last 15 minutes we have to transfer to your prescription for addressing the lack of civic virtue. So why don't you give us just some of your ideas about how to address that, and then I will bring in the questions that people have asked where they seem to be appropriate. So are we going to hell in a handbasket?
Yes. And the handbasket is getting.
You're supposed to say no. This is how we get out of the handbasket.
What time is it again? Am I off screen? Look, I have a lot of faith in liberal democracy because it has survived direct attack from, the Axis, the Soviet Union, the Civil War. I mean, again, what's that fixed human nature that I believe in? I think people want to be free. I think nobody gets up in the morning and says, "Tell me what to do." I sure wish this was North Korea and people would just tell me who I can marry and where I have to work. Nonetheless, when I started writing this book, one of the outside reviewers, is a peer-reviewed book from Oxford, and one of the outside reviewers said, "I hope Tom isn't just going to leave us with a lot of moral hectoring." Okay, I am. That's part of the problem, because I think one of the solutions is that we have to turn to each other and be better examples to each other and have different kinds of arguments with each other. Strangely enough, I've argued for not engaging people as a way of showing a kind of improving our discourse. When someone says, "Well, I think the election was rigged because of Venezuelan voting machines," I think it's perfectly okay to say, "This discussion will demean us both, and I refuse to have it."
Yep.
And if you want to be a better citizen, we're not going to start from that. And if you want to come back and talk to me about something else, I'm happy to do it. If you're starting with rigged elections and Venezuelan voting machines, I wish you all the best. Vaya con Dios. I'm not having this discussion. I also think that we have to be better examples to each other about being informed about politics, and one of the things that really was important to me growing up is that my parents read 2 newspapers a day. My mom had a 9th grade education. My dad had a 10th grade education. And yet, if you asked my father what the tax rate in Massachusetts was and what the local bond issue was, my dad could tell you. He knew that stuff. If you asked him who, Henry Kissinger was and what was going on in Vietnam, he had some idea. He could talk intelligently about it because he read a newspaper. We should be that person again. We can be that. Doesn't mean that you don't have to go to college. Doesn't mean high school has to do it. We can be better informed and more civic in our interactions with each other, including demanding a certain amount of civility and being willing to shun people who refuse to accept those guardrails on public debate. Now, with that said, at the end of the book, I proposed 3 different things, and I purposely proposed kind of small bore projects because I'm so tired, of the heroism impulse. And this is where I'm going to push this almost entirely to people on the left, where they say, what we have to do? We have to abolish the Electoral College and rewrite the Constitution. Let me be the unpleasant grandfather who says that's not going to happen, okay? Get over that. It's not going to happen. So instead of these big, heroic, constitutional overturning measures, I recommended 3 things. First, I think people should be more involved in parties and strengthen them so that parties actually stand for something. Parties now have become flags of convenience for anybody passing through who wants to run for office. And Donald Trump is the poster child for this, but I'm going to throw a zinger here I used to live in Vermont. If Bernie Sanders wants to be the Democratic nominee for president, here's an idea: join the party. I'm a little old-fashioned that way. You want to be president of the club? You have to join the club, and the club should stand for something. The other thing I suggested was we're not going to reactivate the draft. That's not going to happen. But we need to have a common period of service that I think should be living in a barracks for 6 weeks. I said, make it a summer where everybody says, instead of picking up litter and painting, homeless shelters, everybody's going to learn to make their bed, learn how to stand in line, eat together in a cafeteria. And then when it's done, you get a certificate saying, if the country ever needs you, we will call on you. If not, thank you and goodbye, and live your life. Because I think we have fetishized military service by outsourcing it to volunteers. I will probably not make a lot of fans here by saying I don't even like military license plates. I don't like the license plates with medals and which war. I grew up with the World War II generation where the heroism of the people, my father's best friend was a Silver Star winner who did all this like Saving Private Ryan stuff. I didn't know about it until he was dead. There was an ethos of stoicism and service that said, you don't have to thank me for my service. I don't need to fly in business class. I don't need to be the first one seated at the restaurant. That's all very Soviet to me. That bothers me. So just have everybody say, look, I did my summer. I learned how to, handle a gun. I learned how to make a bed, and then move on. And the last one is.
But go a little bit further with that, because you actually talk about in the book how the fetishization of military service is creating sort of a super class.
Yes. I call it the new Spartanism. We're getting a little too close to this kind of Starship Troopers stuff where, when a president thinks that he can make hay by giving blanket pardons to guys that are basically war criminals, that's pretty scary. And the country doesn't erupt. I mean, when I was a kid, the first thing I was really aware of in politics was My Lai. I remember people in my living room at 10 years old arguing about William Calley. And now, the president says, oh, this guy convicted by court-martial, pardon. Because we have developed this notion that soldiers are better than the rest of us. And by the way, I am not anti-military. I'm retiring this winter after 25 years of teaching military officers at the Naval War College. These are my peeps. These are my students. And I think many of them would probably tell you, I know military people have said, I'm uncomfortable when people thank me for my service. It was my honor to serve. It was my privilege to serve. And I think we need to demystify that Spartanism and to have just, this is a military base. This is where people sleep. This is where they eat. You did it for 6 weeks. Now go to college or go get training or go get married, go whatever you want. But it's no longer this, special Spartan mystery that no one's ever experienced. And the last thing I suggested was enlarging, doing some small bore things like you're not going to get rid of the Electoral College, but you can enlarge the House. You can make DC a state. You can make Puerto Rico a state. We have this colonial legacy left over of commonwealths and territories of people that are sort of American, they're American citizens and they sort of live in America, but they're not actually represented in Congress. Well, the House hasn't been enlarged since 1913. Part of the reason the Electoral College is a mess is because it's not representative enough. I don't hate the Electoral College the way other people do. I think of the United States as United States. This is where I'm an old John Adams, yes, I believe in a strong central government, but these are several states that have the right to, have their own state governments and then form a union. But we're getting to a point where in the Senate, we're going to have like 70% of the Senate represented by like 30% of the people. That's not sustainable. That's not a democracy. That's just not going to fly. And you don't have to rip up the Constitution and start over again. You can simply say, okay, add one more electoral vote per state, congressmen plus senators plus one, or enlarge the size of the House, I actually think conservatives, if they weren't so afraid of, the country being taken over by brown people, they would actually say it's a good thing to have a smaller and more responsive congressional district. But this is where, by the way, this is where I'll throw a concession to the folks who bring up money. Conservatives don't mind big congressional districts because then money does matter. As opposed to, I live in Rhode Island. I have literally met all of my elected representatives from the governor on down because it's a small place. I think it'd be great if every place in America was a place where you went, yeah, my congressman, sure, I've met him.
So the Constitution says you can have the floor is 30,000 people for a representative in the House of Representatives, that is a congressperson, and I think the average now is 750,000.
Yeah, it's insane.
We capped the number of people in the House of Representatives in 1929 at 435, and if in fact we still had what we had then as the number of people you needed, I think the number is that we would have over 1,000 people in the House of Representatives, which of course has its own issues, but we have, as you say, baked in now some real problems.
Can we pick something between 435 and 1,000? Sure.
Or some other way to do it.
All right, some other way to do it. Yeah.
So we only have a very few minutes left, and I feel certain that people would like you to answer this one. And that is, are there things that ordinary Americans can do, aside from paying attention to their political parties or agitating for, Washington or Puerto Rico to become a state, to start to restore civic virtue? What would you have people do?
I think they should take their first of all, one thing that Americans don't do across the board in a bipartisan way is vote in state and local elections. And I worked in local government. I just got off the phone the other day with my old boss in the Massachusetts State House. And he's like, why don't young people understand? Because he got elected in his 20s. He said, why don't young people understand? City and state government, they can get elected to those offices and they can have a huge impact on what goes on in their country. But we've, we've bred everybody to think, well, I got to watch the national news. People who can't name their state representatives can tell you why Joe Biden's all hosed up on the infrastructure plan, as if they're going to fix that tomorrow. Now, the other problem is that Republicans and Democrats need to internalize this in a way that they just have not. Republicans are a cult that will vote every time. I mean, when I worked in Republican politics years ago, that was just a turnout. We just knew turnout was always on our side because Republican voters will turn out for dog catcher. And I think everyone needs to turn out and they need to take them seriously. I took a lot of flack recently because someone I knew was running for state representative here in Rhode Island, and she was a Republican. And I said, I'm done voting for, I believe in voting against the Republican Party throughout the grassroots. So, well, I'm not part of the national party. And I said, this is partly my way of dealing with grassroots politics in a way that I want to reverberate. So understand that your local choices do have national impacts. That it's not just a matter of, well, it's the Ward 6 guy or the guy from the 15th Nowhere district. Think this through a little bit more and go vote. And I mean, I know this sounds so pedestrian, right? Get out the vote and be more informed and all that stuff. But, when you look at turnout in elections, in places like I saw that there was a mayoral primary in Seattle, right? Like 12% turnout. You can't complain about city government if you're not for your own party, you're not even turning up, that's not voter suppression to have a 12% turnout in a Democratic primary in Seattle, Washington. That's just people not caring. That's people saying, I'd rather, talk about national politics because local primaries are boring. So pay attention to local and state politics. That's where you live. That's where you can have the impact.
All right. So can you leave us then in the last 2 minutes with any kind of hope for reversing this crisis in democracy and in our civic virtue?
Sure we're not out of time? Well, let me tell you a story that you started with, Heather. You talked about the great Indian food scandal that I talk about in the book, right? I made this offhand Twitter comment because my academic colleagues are always dragging me off to Indian restaurants, and I just hate Indian food. And I said, nobody could like Indian food. I'm an only child, nothing. If I don't like it, no one can like it. It's awful. And it became this, like within a day, I was in every newspaper in India, Russia, the UK. I was on, people were doing stories about me on Fox and the BBC. I mean, it was a nightmare. Like my life blew up for 2 days because I hated on Indian food. People called me a racist and genocide and all this stuff. So I said, okay, we have to be more careful about the interconnectedness which we didn't talk a lot about tonight, but this interconnectedness is making us crazy. We are too connected to each other. We talk to each other too much. We're not meant to spend this much time talking to each other. So, okay, that finally, Preet Bharara, the former assistant DA and assistant U.S. attorney in New York, he says, when this pandemic lifts, I'm going to take you out for Indian food and you're going to change your mind. I said, all right, you're on. Well, this summer, Preet and I met in New York and he said, we're just going to order stuff and you're going to try. I said, okay, you know, I'm putting myself in your hands. And Preet opened up a GoFundMe just before we went out saying, listen, I'm getting Tom Nichols to eat Indian food. Make a contribution for COVID relief in India. You know, because I managed to drag Tom to it. And I basically said, listen, if you people will donate, I will certainly eat. And I actually found stuff that I liked. I had to change my mind. I particularly am a fan of lamb biryani, which I really liked. I mean, I still don't like curries. I don't like a lot of this stuff. It's too spicy. I'm a New Englander. You know, I think putting butter on a lobster is pushing it, you know.
And this, by the way, happened over Twitter, as I recall.
Yes.
Right?
So this is a place where social media became a force for good because we started taking pictures. And here's what Tom's going to order next. And here's what Preet had. We woke up the next morning and found out that people following us had donated $130,000 for COVID relief in India. We literally staffed out an entire COVID ward in India from doing this. So I ate crow along with some lamb biryani. Preet and I, began a wonderful friendship that we had a lovely evening out, and thousands and thousands of people opened their hearts and their wallets and helped people in a faraway country from the United States with COVID relief. So there can be really good moments if we just put aside our ego and our narcissism and our tribal gripes with each other for 10 minutes and have a nice plate of lamb biryani.
Well, that is a wonderful note on which to end this. And I want to thank you for being here and for writing this book, which now that I'm not looking at my notes, I will hold up. And to thank the JFK Library and the people who arranged this so that we could go ahead and have this wonderful evening. And good luck with the book. Good luck with returning America to a land of civic virtue. And I really look forward to both to following you on Twitter and to working with you again. Thanks for being here, Tom, and thank you to the JFK Library, and thank you to everybody who is here with us and spent the last hour and a half with us.
Thank you to all of you as well. Thank you very much.